Alan, esta pregunta está relacionada con los paneles 8 y 9 de la exposición. El panel 8 presenta las diferentes condiciones urbanas que propiciaron nuevas configuraciones volumétricas de la casa en el predio. El panel 9 plantea que las variaciones de la casa presentadas en el panel 8, como configuración volumétrica, tipo de acceso y existencia y posición de la escalera, determinan cuatro interpretaciones: el hall nuclear, el hall diferenciador, estamos viéndolo en este momento, el hall extensor y el hall integrador. Alan, ¿qué opinión tienes de lo planteado en estos paneles 8 y 9 y su representación gráfica? Tienes la palabra, Alan.
I think this, in some ways, follows from what I was saying about the shift in the perception of language as modernism arrives. But there is also a strong social element to this. I don't know enough about the history of the middle classes in Colombia to know how things changed. I can really only speak about England and perhaps America. In this period, domestic servants are less frequent and may not live in the house, which is a great liberation in terms of architectural planning. You don't have to separate servants and family. Central heating is more readily available, so a large space is no longer a problem in terms of heating, or theoretically it isn't. It may in England still be very cold. And the leaders of modern architecture have declared that space is what architecture is about, above all. And Le Corbusier has established this idea that double height space is especially wonderful. And all architects therefore learn about it. And you get the hall back as a result. It comes from these different factors, I think. They point towards a high, spacious room with multifunctions. The gender differences are easing, perhaps. They are not over, but they are no longer as rigidly enforced as they were before, perhaps. Children are still rather invisibly segregated, I think, and from the case studies I've looked at, but are perhaps not so much segregated as before. So the result is a big room in which people move and behave in ways that are different to before. Clothing, I think, makes a difference. I was very interested that a furniture designer explained to me that in the 1960s, the fact that women started wearing tights rather than stockings meant that you could sit in completely different postures. You could sit on the floor, most particularly. She gave a lecture which says, when we sat on the floor, and that is entirely to do with clothing. And we recognize that as a feature of the period, and you had floor cushions and seating changes, and the seat level of the seat gets lower on the whole. Beyond that, it's interesting, the picture of a staircase coming down that has been on the screen several times, I think is a consistent feature from the arts and crafts onwards. The stairs are not so much for going up as for coming down. This may sound paradoxical, but it is important to be able to make an entry. It's like coming on stage. And that is best done by descending a staircase. I think particularly in the case of the hostess of the house, to come down the stairs graciously is what it's about. It's a piece of theatrical scenery. And the whole ritual of entertaining guests, I think, is extraordinarily important in terms of halls. If you go back in England, maybe I'm digressing here out of the frame that we're in, but the idea of calling cards, which was extremely important up until the Second World War, that the lady of the house would have an at-home afternoon and receive people from the neighborhood, and this is how you established your place in a local society, was through calling, and your card was a very important part of that, and there was a very firmly established ritual about how this was done. So it's not quite the same as that, but I think we forget how important the hall is for that function as well. So before I digress any further, I'll stop.
Antes de retomar en la discusión quizá estos temas que comentaba el profesor Powers, quería ampliar un poco en esta intervención que la expansión urbana en Bogotá produjo combinaciones de trazados muy heterogéneos a partir de la reinterpretación del modelo de ciudad-jardín, con una flexibilidad normativa que permitió diferentes posibilidades de implantación y ocupación en los predios, tanto por su amplitud en área como por su regularidad. En los años 40 se plantearon tramas relativamente ortogonales, con algunas vías diagonales, con predios muy amplios y de morfología variable, y para los años 50 se desarrollaron trazados muy regulares, con manzanas rectangulares y homogéneas, en barrios de vías amplias para automóviles, caminos peatonales y espacios verdes. En el panel 8 se expone que las diferentes condiciones urbanas propiciaron nuevas configuraciones volumétricas, dentro de las cuales era frecuente encontrar la estructura espacial del hall intermedio. Una de ellas es la denominada aislada con volúmenes agrupados, implantada en un gran predio, definida por uno o más volúmenes que conformaban conjuntos en su mayoría asimétricos. Otra muy recurrente es la denominada semiaislada o continua con volúmenes diferenciados que se ensamblan y se adosan a los límites del predio, en la cual predominaba un volumen principal de 2 plantas al que se anexaban 1 o 2 secundarios. Y una tercera, denominada continua y compacta con vacíos interiores, de una sola planta o planta principal, estructurada a partir de crujías paralelas adosadas a los límites del predio, con vacíos interiores o solarios.
Por arquitectos locales o emigrados, una experiencia que curiosamente no ha dejado apenas rastro físico ni diríamos cultural en Bogotá. De los ejemplos mostrados se deduce que el modelo de ciudad-jardín, sean casas finca, casas a la inglesa o casas modernas, posee limitaciones para construir la ciudad en su complejidad. El estudio de la implantación de la casa en su parcela halla 3 configuraciones. Resumo lo que ha dicho Margarita. Aislada, si la casa no contacta con los límites de la parcela. Semi-aislada, si lo hace con algunos. Continua compacta, si la parcela se convierte en casa, como sucedía en la ciudad colonial. Los propios arquitectos modernos percibieron el valor limitado del modelo de ciudad-jardín, pues consume mucho suelo, urbanización e infraestructuras, y no es, en definitiva, ni ciudad ni jardín. La modernidad no consolidó en Bogotá partes de ciudad verdaderamente modernas, aún disponiendo de instrumentos como podrían ser la teoría del Mietwohnbebauung de Hilbersheimer, que trabajó desde 1927 a 1940, que maneja los 2 parámetros, ocupación del suelo, densidad de habitantes, con sabiduría. Combinación de edificios alta sobre vergeles urbanos, esto introduce la densidad urbana, con casas bajas compactas, ocupando suelo, pero sumando sus jardines al tapiz verde. Urbs in orto, la metrópolis en el jardín, decía Hilbersheimer. Muchos casos mostrados en la exposición servirían a tal fin. A tal fin sería construir este modelo teórico en Bogotá. la Casa Bermúdez, que ha aparecido varias veces aquí, y las casas de Obregón y Valenzuela, por ejemplo, casas con patio, la de Bermúdez con un hall intermedio, de tal modo que habría un sincretismo entre el hall y el patio que conjugaría la Bogotá colonial con la inglesa a través de los elementos espaciales lógicos de la arquitectura.
Hello, Alan. I'd like to come back to some of the points actually that you were making right at the start. Now, the images that will accompany me now as I'm speaking will be of houses which will, I would have thought, probably be as unfamiliar to you as they were to me. But what they are doing is that they are showing that a series of modernist houses in modernist Colombian houses use a hall. It's called here a differentiating hall. It's used a hall as a space that separates primarily between other places, but nevertheless results in a place that has an architectural, a self-conscious architectural quality in its own right. You might almost draw an analogy back to the medieval houses and say we're talking here not about the Great Hall, but we're talking about the Screen's Passage as a kind of entrance point, which things are separated out through. What I was wondering was whether you could perhaps give us an idea from your own very wide knowledge of modern houses in England from the 1920s onwards up to, let's say, 1960s, whether you can think of any examples where entrance spaces of these sorts or spaces that divide between other rooms have been treated as a distinct architectural space in its own right. And to pick up a theme which I raised with John yesterday, whether these houses were photographed, because we know that many of them were photographed very well, they were photographed in a way that was intended to show that these entry halls, which in some cases are scarcely more than lobbies, are significant architectural spaces in their own right, which might carry some of the significance of the old idea of the hall as we've seen it in earlier periods. I think that's probably, it's a rather complicated way of saying, can you see from your own experience entrance lobbies in modern houses trying to represent some of the features of the traditional Great Hall?
Yes. Well, if I understood rightly some of the earlier comments, I think it's very interesting in the sense that these post-1945 modern houses are all, in most cases, aspiring to be villas. They are not sites of production. Or if production is present, it's hidden, for example, in the kitchen or wherever the laundry is done. And they are depicting a world of leisure. You know, you do not work from home in these houses, I would say. And that's the world in which many of us grew up. And now we're in a changed world in an interesting way, I think. Beyond that, yes, the idea of the isolation, I think, was seen as a very important one. It still is in the USA, which really leads me through to my response to Tim, because it immediately took me to the 1964 book, Community and Privacy, by Serge Chimaev and Christopher Alexander, which may be familiar. I don't think it's a terribly insightful book, but it was an attempt by these two people, neither of them born in England, but both raised and educated in England, then transplanted to America, Chimaev and Alexander, to understand and then to try and combat the standard American suburban house, which they considered to be very wasteful of land, and to isolate the inhabitants from each other. And they were in favor of forms that would create a different social ambiance. At the same time, I have to say, having met Chimaev and written a book about him, I think he was far more interested in privacy than he was in community. I don't think he liked other people very much. But he had this rather simplistic set of diagrams in that book of how, if you analyze separate rooms, you might have a connecting space between them, which could indeed be the kind of vestigial entrance hall that Tim was talking about. And then he says, if you think about what's going on in these rooms, actually a lot of the functions really belong somewhere else because they are shared by all the people in the house. So he says the transitional space, the passageway, as it were, becomes a realm in its own right. And he does a diagram to show the expansion of this middle space and the shrinking of the pieces at either end, which are the more specific and more private spaces. Now, that, of course, comes in terms of date right at the end of the period we're talking about, but maybe it actually reflects something of what has gone before. The other thing that Chimaev was trying to promote through this book was courtyard houses, single story, because he said when you get to 2 stories, you create a lot of problems, particularly of overlooking. If you revert to, as it were, the house types of ancient Rome, you have much more freedom to use outdoor space because nobody is going to look down on you. And therefore you can distribute courtyards more freely through the footprint of the plan, and many of the rooms can open out onto outdoor space. So it caught on, but only to a limited extent. I think this alternative isolation is still what people seem to want in houses, and we see it certainly in England in kind of houses that are built for sale. Still, they are all trying to pretend that the neighboring houses are not there. And it's very painful to see the results sometimes. Has that in any way answered the question? The houses in Bogota, yes, perhaps there is a self-conscious, not quite a screen's passage, I don't think. In the end, I would come back to the theme I've been referring to throughout, which is how are people living? What do they actually do in these spaces? And I think one of the features of the post-war modern period is that space is more expensive. People cannot be so lavish with it as they had been before, and therefore it has to perform more flexibly, for one thing, and accommodate a greater variety of uses. What, of course, is interesting that happens after 1965 is certainly in England, is the return of the kitchen to be the central space of the home, which it now is everywhere. And people who have very large and expensive houses, the kitchen now is the hub. And it has sort of taken on some of the functions, I think, of the middle hall. And it's very interesting. It may not be the place where cooking is done, but it's still symbolically the kitchen. And one day somebody will write about this, and I think it's going to be very amusing to see how the symbolism of the kitchen has become detached from the reality of preparing food.